Welcome to the deep dive. We take dense but fascinating material and really try to boil it down to the essential insights.
Yeah, designed for you, someone who's curious and, wants to get smart fast, but without losing the depth.
Exactly. And today, our deep dive is focused on understanding this shift from being driven by action to a state of renouncement.
That's right. We're looking at a specific source, verses 13 through 20 of chapter 5 from Gita for Joyful Living. The chapter itself is called Renouncement Through Action.
Okay, renouncement through action. So the mission here seemed to be unpacking this idea that even though we're all constantly doing things,
Always a busy.
working, relating, chasing goals,
Yeah.
there's a path towards a kind of liberation that involves renouncement.
Mm.
But it's maybe not just, quitting everything cold turkey.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The text actually starts by explaining how we get caught up in this cycle of action in the first place, how we feel bound by it.
How does it work?
Well, it outlines a process. It begins with just interacting with the world through our senses, our thoughts, words, actions, and how that naturally leads us to form likes and dislikes.
Right, that seems pretty fundamental. You encounter something, you react. I like this. Ooh, I don't like that. Basic human stuff.
And these reactions, these likes and dislikes, the text says they create these little imprints, you could say, or preferences in our minds.
Okay, like mental habits.
Sort of.
Yeah.
And these preferences then become the fuel for our desires. It's like those initial reactions set us up for what we then actively want to get or want to avoid.
So it's a chain reaction. Like, dislike leads to a mental preference,
Mm-hmm.
which sparks a desire.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're thinking about it, maybe talking about it, and finally taking action to get whatever it is or push it away.
Exactly. And the text points out this is where the trouble starts, because we begin to believe our happiness actually depends on getting these desired things.
Right. More stuff, more experiences.
The more we chase, sometimes the more we feel we need, which ironically often leads to more dissatisfaction because we become so reliant on external things.
And that's the binding, being dependent on these sense objects, as the text calls them.
That's the core idea, yes. Our dependence, driven by our desires and actions. So the really key thing here is that it's our internal reactions and the subsequent actions that create the entanglement, not the objects themselves.
That's a powerful distinction. It's not the cake, it's my craving for the cake, and the actions I take driven by that craving and the attachment to that pleasure.
Precisely. And that's why, so many people feel stuck. These desires can feel incredibly strong, almost like they are our happiness. So the idea of just giving them up, it seems impossible.
Yeah, I think everyone can relate to that feeling of being overwhelmed by things you have to do or things you desperately want, like being on a treadmill you can't get on.
Exactly that feeling.
So if we're kind of caught in this action trap, what's the way out? This is where karma yoga, renouncement through action, comes in.
Yes, exactly. The text is quite practical. It acknowledges that just stopping all action, very difficult, maybe impossible for most of us.
Okay.
So instead, it introduces the idea of controlled action. Action driven not just by those raw desires, but by our intelligence, our understanding.
Controlled action, how does that work?
This is karma yoga.
Hmm.
It means performing your actions, your duties, but dedicating them to something higher, maybe God, maybe a principle, and crucially, accepting whatever results come as a gift without that intense personal attachment.
So it's shifting the why behind the action.
Yes, and the relationship to the outcome. You're still doing things, participating in life, but the inner motivation and the clinging to specific results start to change.
So it's less about what you do, maybe, and more about the inner state while you're doing it.
That's a great way to put it. The text uses an analogy, a husband who loves his wife but doesn't know she's unfaithful. His actions are driven by pure emotion, by his attachment. Controlled action in that scenario would mean acting with awareness, observing clearly, not being totally blinded by his feelings. That allows him to see the truth eventually.
Okay, so acting with more awareness, less attachment to getting exactly what I want helps us see things more clearly, including maybe the fact that the things we're chasing aren't giving us that lasting happiness we think they will.
That's a huge insight from Karma Yoga, yes.
Right.
It helps us experience firsthand the temporary nature of pleasure from sense objects. And that realization, the text emphasizes, is a really vital step toward, deeper spiritual understanding, towards knowing ourselves.
Like turning on a light.
Exactly, like sunlight, dispelling darkness. The clarity you gain starts to dissolve the ignorance about where true, lasting fulfillment comes from.
Okay, that makes sense. So this naturally leads to the stages, right? How we actually move from being totally desire-driven to eventually the state of renouncement. Can you walk us through those stages?
Sure. Stage 1 is basically what we started with, uncontrolled action, driven purely by desires, likes, dislikes, acting to get pleasure, avoid pain, often without much conscious thought.
The default mode for many, perhaps.
Probably. Then, stage 2 is introducing this controlled action, karma yoga. We start mentally detaching from the results, dedicating the action, even though we're still physically doing things.
So it's still working, still looking after family, whatever it is, but the inner attitude is shifting. Less, what's in it for me?
Precisely. Less focus on personal gain. Then, stage 3 is where a real conviction develops. A deep personal understanding, not just intellectual, that lasting happiness isn't found in external things.
And that makes the desires fade.
Naturally, yes. The intense craving for material things starts to diminish because you see they don't deliver in the long run. Stage 4 is then a conscious turning inward, actively seeking self-knowledge.
Trying to find the real source of happiness.
Yes, understanding our true nature, what the text calls the Atman, the eternal, joyful self, and seeing that as the source.
And the final stage, stage 5.
That's complete renouncement of action, and this is key, it's rooted in that right understanding, that self-knowledge. It doesn't always mean physically stopping everything.
Oh, right. So you could still be active.
You could, but you see actions differently. They don't bind you anymore because you understand the deeper reality. Your old preferences don't create selfish desires because you see through the illusion.
So the enlightened person has a totally different view. They see the underlying reality.
Exactly. They understand the universe is made of these core components, aura, energy, matter, the text mentions, all sustained by the Atman. So while they interact with different objects, their mind sees the unchanging Atman within everything. It's like that analogy of sweets, different shapes, maybe different colors, but they're all made of sugar, essentially.
Ah, okay. So the child sees the variety, but the adult knows the common ingredient. The enlightened person sees the unity behind the diversity.
Yes. They operate on two levels. The relative, where you still treat a cow differently from a dog, practically speaking. But also the absolute, where you understand the fundamental oneness underlying both.
Now, the text also introduces an acronym, PORT, related to renouncement. What's that about?
Right, port. It's just a handy way to categorize the external things we're often involved with. Possessions, obligations or duties, responsibilities, and transactions.
The ORT. Okay.
And the idea is that renouncement often involves reducing or changing our relationship with these things. Then it describes two main types of renouncement.
Two types. What are they?
First is renouncement as a means. This is more about deliberately, maybe physically, reducing your port, owning less, simplifying duties.
Why would someone do that?
The goal is usually to create mental space, to quiet the mind, making it easier to focus on seeking self-knowledge, perhaps through meditation or study. It's a tool to help the inner journey.
Okay, like choosing a simpler life to help focus inward. Makes sense. What's the second type?
The second type is renouncement as an end. This is primarily a mental shift that happens more spontaneously after someone achieves self-realization or what the text calls joyful living.
So it's a result, not a method.
Exactly. Because they now deeply understand that worldly things don't bring ultimate happiness, they naturally, mentally let go of attachment to actions and results. Physical renouncement might happen, or it might not.
So someone could still be quite active, have possessions, responsibilities.
Absolutely.
But internally, they're free.
Yeah.
Detached. Not driven by selfish desire. The text mentions a religious leader example.
Yes, someone who might manage a large organization, lots of duties, but has achieved that inner mental renouncement. The key is the internal state. They still act, perform duties, but without personal attachment or expecting personal gain from it.
They don't feel bound by those actions anymore.
Correct. They see them as just part of the natural flow, not something creating binding karma for them.
And this all circles back to self-knowledge being the absolute key to unlocking this mental freedom, this true renouncement. The verses you mentioned really drive this home.
They do. Verse 13 says the self-controlled person mentally renounces actions through knowledge. Verse 14 clarifies the Atman, the true self, doesn't act or cause action that's nature doing its thing.
So it's not us acting in that ultimate sense.
Not the deepest us. Verse 15 says the Atman isn't touched by good or bad deeds. Our feeling affected comes from ignorance. But then, verse 16 is hopeful. Knowledge destroys that ignorance like the sun burns away fog.
Ah, lovely image.
And verses 17 to 20 describe the person living in that knowledge. They see the same reality, the same Brahman, In all beings, from the learned scholar to the cow to the dog, they achieve equanimity.
Balanced in pleasure and pain.
Exactly. They conquer the cycle of birth and death because they are situated in that unchanging reality in Brahman and God.
Wow. So it's a real journey described here,
Mhm.
from feeling trapped by desires and actions,
Mhm.
through practicing karma yoga, gaining understanding,
Realizing the nature of happiness.
to finally achieving this profound self-knowledge, which brings about a natural state of inner freedom, mental renouncement, regardless of what you might be doing on the outside.
That captures it perfectly. It's a gradual path. And the mental transformation is really the ultimate goal described here.
Really fascinating. It definitely gives you a lot to think about regarding your own life, your own actions.
For sure.
So for you listening, maybe take a moment to consider, where are your actions coming from? Are they mostly from those uncontrolled desires, those likes and dislikes? Or is there more conscious intention there?
Yeah. And how does this idea of mental renouncement, just loosening your grip on needing specific outcomes, feel? Could that shift your experience?
Could it maybe lead towards a more, well, joyful way of living, as the source suggests, something to mull over? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.